I'm privileged here to have somebody as a friend of mine who I've known you, Kevin, since pretty well the beginning of the pandemic. I think we knew one another a bit prior to that, but we really got to know one another well then. But to probably properly introduce you will probably take me half an hour, but I'm going to do the best with your official title. I believe it is Reverend Canon Dr. Kevin George, the rector of St. Aidan's Anglican Church. Do I have that right?
Well, you have it right, except to say I'm just Kevin.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think Lorena Dixon on CGBK, she calls you, is it Revy Kevy?
Revy Kevin. Yeah, when I've been an uncle since the moment of conception. I have a
Nice.
nephew who's older than me, and I was always Uncle Kevy,
Yeah,
Uncle Kevy. And then when I got ordained, my family started calling me Uncle Revy Kevy, and
okay.
then it sort of stuck. So my nickname through the years has been Revy Kevy.
No, that's good. You and I have worked a fair bit in the last couple of years on some issues we'll get into later. But I did want to talk to you a bit. I wrote an article on you in the Free Press in January of 2021. So
Mm.
that was a year and a half ago. But I was talking about what faith groups were attempting to do to keep themselves alive during COVID. And it turned out that many of them were doing things that were to try to help the people that were marginalized.
Yeah.
They weren't just trying to get on Zoom and trying to have a religious service. They were finding unique ways to get out into the community. And I wonder if you could just tell us some of the unique things that you came up with. You don't have to take too long, but some of them I thought were really quite innovative. What did you do when COVID hit? How did you figure out what you were going to do?
Well, it was. I mean, it's hard to imagine now. It's been over 2 years actually, but after the initial shock of okay, well, what do we do now? We're not gathering. It was really then became a process of discernment and soul searching and prayer. Okay, well, how do we continue to keep our own people together? But also, what does it mean that we're being uh, provoked or prodded or chased out of our buildings, in a sense? And I use those words intentionally because I realize that there's a disease factor, a pandemic, but I also believe, from a faith perspective, the Holy Spirit was active in this, and we were being chased. The Celtics say that the Holy Spirit is like a wild goose and not a peaceful dove. The wild goose, if you live in this city, you can be chased by geese pretty well. And so I think we were being chased out, driven from our buildings. And so for us, it meant, Good Friday prayers and on the front lawn of the Middlesex London Detention Center, to try and highlight the state of what's going on with prisoners in that facility. It meant doing prayers around town in front of the police station. We went to different locations to do online prayers out in the wilderness to hold up, the nature that we have around us. We had a series with our young people of reading The Hobbit, where they'd go and read in different places, and we'd make a video and send out. And then also just, we've become increasingly more aware of the earth around us. And so some of the projects that we got involved with you, Glenn, with Food Bank, around bringing these greenhouses in here and getting our people involved, from planting seeds at home to harvesting vegetables to take to the neighborhood through the food bank, has been another way for us to engage not just the people in our church, but we've got people who sign on from around the community who come to help with that. And we did that in the interfaith sense last year as well, with folks from the
Yeah,
mosque and the temple coming as well.
yeah. So, Kevin, that's the local picture of where we're at. But I did want to ask you a pretty serious question because it has been troubling me. You and I are both people of religious sentiment, right? I'm United, and I know you're Anglican. Jane, my wife, was brought up in the Anglican Church, so she favors you more than me, I'm sure. But anyway,
As she should.
good. um, I am wondering, Kevin, so much of the work, I remember, I think it was 25 years ago, somebody, a politician, had said that it's time to do away with churches because, they're not really doing all that much. And I had started at the food bank just 5 years before that. So I started working with social services at City Hall, as well as interviewing a number of the groups that we had been helping as a food bank. And then we took a poll of those groups, of their volunteers, and also of their staff. And it turned out that 82% of the people that were involved in these different activities related to poverty and social justice were people of religious persuasion or from faith communities. So I took that back to the person who had said, the politician who has said this, and he was flabbergasted, right? He just had no idea. So I think I've always known, and I run into them everywhere. I meet Muslims have a food drive for somebody. The Sikhs do something to help a woman shelter. I know that the Christian churches work on things as well, and the Jewish folks have always been active, involved in social justice issues. But it's something that they do quietly. They don't talk about too much, so the public doesn't see them necessarily as relevant on these social issues. And for those of us who work in it, we know that they are. My question for you, and I think it's a very, very important one, as the poverty situation worsens and as the dark clouds that are on the horizon economically or with war or with climate change or with inflation, it goes on and on. For the people who are marginalized, they have really learned to trust and come to depend on the various faith persuasions to be there for them as they needed. As the churches and religious groups have had their troubles in the last few decades, numbers of dwindling, so on and so forth, I worry, to be honest with you, about the impact of that on all the lunch programs, the helping with housing, the women's programs, all of those things. I worry about the effect on that as governments to some degree withdraw from those realms. They really need this civil society to step up, and the churches and faith groups have really done that. Do you worry about that? Do you wonder what's going to happen if the faith groups themselves continue? They're struggling, they're doing their best, but that they continue to shrink.
Yeah, I do worry about it, and I've seen the effects of it actually. I mean, even here in the city, we had a pretty robust program operating at a Bishop Cronin church downtown, which we've since closed. And with the closure of that community, that parish community, meant the disappearance of, a whole bunch of really neat stuff that was happening in that neighborhood. And a lot of us lamented at the time the fact that we were losing that. And my hope is, the hope I see, and I worry about it, but the hope I see in it is that with people like Todd Townsend, our bishop, who really has put an emphasis on trying to find ways for our communities, our churches, to be sort of a focal point for the neighborhood, for us to be a resource for the neighborhood. So that we're no longer or less focused on what's going on inside and more focused on what's going on out there.
Yeah.
And he seems really, intent on seeing us shift our focus that way. And I've seen it here in my own community. So my hope is that as we restructure, because we really do need some serious renovation, not just a little touch up, as we close buildings, how do we, and this is the question that internally in the Anglican Church, I think we're all trying to navigate right now in the Diocese of Huron anyway, and beyond, is how do we now create strong centers of ministry in the city? And if they're not 17 or 18 anymore, if there are half a dozen, say 10 years down the road, how do we fund those half a dozen parishes in such a way, not just with money, but with resources and people? How do we steward them in such a way that what's going on in the neighborhood is a focus that's not down here with what's left over after we pay the bills and everything, but how do we start with the idea of our reason for being is to walk in the way of Jesus? And if we're going to walk in the way of Jesus, then that means we're going to have to go to where the weak and the vulnerable and the poor and the broken live, because there's no way to get around it in terms of scripture. God has a disproportionate love for the poor. Mm-hmm. and it's incumbent upon us to find a way to do it. And I think in many ways we've lost sight of that. I mean, I think it's true what you said earlier, that we've always had strong pockets of it, but on the whole, the institution has often forgotten that that's our reason for being. And we become so self-serving that we've lost sight of that. And so I hope that with the sale of buildings, for instance, we find ways to use those resources to build strong faith communities in our cities that can not just continue to work as being done, but actually increase it in such a way that we're actually making a bigger impact.
Yeah, I guess part of it, I remember my parents telling me, they struggled economically prior to World War II, but during the Depression, churches and faith groups became essential. As people traveled to them to try to get food or overnight lodging or help because they couldn't find work because the Depression was on. And then after the war, we that generation of people came together and decided they wanted to build institutions that dealt with these issues. So things like, hospitals, universities, healthcare, retirement programs, so on and so forth, and social programs.
Yeah.
And those social programs, were well funded in most cases. It tended to go across the board because back in those days, the province paid 50% and the federal government paid 50% towards these different programs that were there. So the funding was fairly stable and it worked. And I think during that time, I think churches kind of retreated from this dealing with the people that you're talking about, the people that were on the margins, that faith groups are so good at doing during the Depression and previous to that, that we kind of got away from it. And now, as we're moving into this particular era that we are in now, as governments themselves begin to withdraw from that social services space and programs are either cut or minimized or whatever it's going to be, suddenly now churches are confronting a similar world that they confronted back in the Depression. So will they have what it takes? Back then, they were far more populous than they are now,
And younger.
and younger. And will they have what it takes to be able to pivot now and help communities to reach that group of marginalized? Do you feel that same way about social programs and stuff got people to step out, or do you have a different view on that?
No, I think it did actually not only step out, but forget how to do it. I mean, I think a lot of our communities have, remember all those years ago, Pierre Burton called the comfortable pew, right?
Yeah.
All those years ago, when the more that our government, gladly, I will say, because I believe in good, strong social nets from our government, stepped in. I think that for a lot of communities that were comfortable, and as communities, as church communities moved out of the core of our urban centers and started setting up in suburbs like this one, for instance, in these neighborhoods where poverty was the thing that happens down there.
Yeah.
And that church can deal with that, and we can fund a little money or do a little something. And we've forgotten how to do it. And so for many of us, it's been about, I talk about it in terms of teaching discipleship. I think these are basic tenets of discipleship. I think that we're called in our baptism to seek and serve Christ in all persons, not some, not just the ones we like. We're called to strive for peace and unity among all people and respect the dignity of every human being. Imagine that. How do you deal with that? How do I respect the dignity of somebody I just spoke to on the street this morning, who I tried to help in some way, and Donald Trump on the other hand? I'm called to respect the dignity of both. That's difficult work, but we're also called to engage the environment around us and respect God's creation. And how do we do all of that? And so for me, I think if our communities are going to continue not just to do the work we're doing, but find a way to be more, I hesitate to use the word relevant, because I always believe the gospel of Jesus is relevant. I think sometimes the church has lost sight of the narrative of the gospel of Jesus. And so one of the things that at least I've tried to do, and I'm fortunate to belong to a community of St. Aidan's here, which actually tries as well, I think, is to continue to go back to that story, the good news story, the gospel story, and say, how do we live out this call that we've got in such a way that we can try and be more relevant, not because we want to be relevant in the milieu to culture, but more relevant to the gospel, more relevant into how we live, and that's going to take, and I hope we can partner with things like government, right? Like, so my hope is, I know sometimes governments have been shy to get involved in faith groups, and I get all that. There's a lot of people who think we have an American ethos here of separation of church and state, which of course doesn't exist in Canada. But what I would hope is that the governments are able to pick up on what you said earlier, understand a rich history of how much support churches have given, not just churches, but faith groups, mosques, temples, all of that, but what these faith communities have given. And then with the monies that they want to target to do good work, what the government wants to target money to do good work, use the resources that are in our community to do that. So what I'm saying is, don't give us money to prop up my salary or to pay for a building, but make resources available to communities that have expertise. We would call it ministry experience in doing this work, and get it right on the ground, right where you need it,
Yeah. You know, Kevin, 3 years ago, just prior to COVID, the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, of course, this meets every year, and it has the prime ministers. I think Donald Trump was there at that one 'cause he was president back then. But they always get these dignitaries from around the world to come to it. So these are business leaders, nonprofits, so on and so forth. And for the first time, they had asked all of the faith leaders,
Mm.
the key ones around the world, to come together and speak to the conference. And they did. And what was so surprising to people that were there, I wrote about this too in the Free Press. What was so surprising was the level of cooperation they are actually doing now.
Mhm.
And the reason why the World Economic Forum asked them to become part of it is because they were trying to address poverty or climate change, but it was the poorest regions of the world that were really, really set on by all of these things. And they realized, the economic forum, that it was actually faith groups that were in those areas. They were sacrificed. They were building field hospitals, right? They were trying to help people get settled as refugees. I mean, it goes on and on. I understand that. But I find it so interesting that at a time when the world's faiths are cooperating, and I want to get that into the next part of that in the next question. But at a time when that is happening, our
Mm.
politics has never been so divided,
Yeah.
right? I've seen lots of businesses here in London who have combined to help with food drives, to help with housing,
Yeah.
a number of different things. So even the faith community, I'm sorry, the business community is coming together, and yet our politics does not reflect that. And I think in that sense, we need to set up a kind of alternative narrative that I think we probably had in Canada before politics became so big, and it was
Right.
everything, and it had a huge following, and it wasn't as partisan. But it seems to me that on a global scale, the faith communities are coming together. The World Economic Forum sees that. So it's how we actualize that at a local level. So, and I know one of the ways that you have done that is I know that when the terrible thing happened, a year ago, we just had the anniversary when the Muslim family was killed. You helped with leading the march to do all of that. But then you put a greenhouse at your church and called it Abraham's tent.
Mhm.
So I know you are very much involved in bringing the faith groups together, but not just to worship, but to actually have impact on the community and the marginalized. Can you go into that a bit as to what you do?
Yeah. So for me, I mean, I years ago had to confront my own um, bigotries, I suppose is the best way to put it, if I be bluntly honest. I mean, I grew up in a very homogeneous white Protestant culture in a small community in Newfoundland. And so that's what you're bathed in. And when you come out of that and you land in a multicultural place like London, Ontario, or previously Windsor, I had a lot of learning to do. And one of the hardest things for me to do was to shut up and listen, because if you know me, I talk a lot. And but I did, because I started to hear stories that I was unable to find words to respond to because of the pain and the hurt and the prejudice and the hatred.
Mm,
Um, and it called me out of asking, it called me out of my own faith, it called me in my own faith to ask questions about, to go back to what I was saying earlier, how can I be faithful as a Christian if the minute I see somebody who's different than me, my immediate impulse is make them like me? Well,
mhm.
how do I respect the dignity of that person if that's how I respond?
Yeah.
And so, I began work down in Windsor and then carried that over here. So a lot of it is around relationship building. And so what that means is, when there was an attack in Pittsburgh on a mosque, or on a temple, pardon me, on a synagogue, we showed up over at the temple here in London. When the attack happened in Saint Foy, Quebec, we were on the step of the mosque. When there was a shooting in the churches in Sri Lanka, they filled St. Aidan's here. They came from the mosque and from the temple, and they filled the church. We try to stand alongside of one another. And quite organically, what's happened is myself and Imam Abdel Fattah Tawakol and Rabbi Deborah Dressler have sort of, the three of us, become leaders in this, I guess, because what I have found personally are two very willing partners. We see the world differently. We can't get around. We can't get around that. Our faiths are very different, but our call to love and justice, peace and honor, respect among people, those things are the same. And so, when I finished this 55-hour sermon I did here a few years ago, the first guy to greet me when I got off stage with a big embrace was Imam Tawaka. And he is one of my closest friends in faith.
Mm.
And so I think that for me, I think the way forward for us as Christian communities is to be in better relationship with other faith communities. And I believe that to be true of them as well. So whether it's Abraham's tent or coming together in crisis or finding ways to address issues around us that come up as they come up. I know Deborah Dressler and I have been talking in this last couple of weeks after the march here about how to more formalize our relationships so that we might be able to respond more quickly to social need in our community and
Yeah.
mobilize our communities to actually do some more work.
Yeah. And it's also true that in Canada, the Muslim faith is growing. A lot of that is due to
Mhm.
immigration, but it's growing. The Christian faith is somewhat shrinking, and the Jewish faith is staying largely the same. But the reality is they do represent significant resources, especially in the area of people power and compassion. So, do you think that we will? Do you see a time when you think that we will take that coming together as different faiths and then pivot together to take on some of these larger challenges together? Because it seems
I,
to me the Anglicans have their work to do, and the homeless, the United do the same, the Jewish
yeah.
community and the Muslims do the same. If we combine our efforts, it'd be very interesting. But do you see that coming?
Well, I pray it's coming. I pray that it's coming at least in the way that we can honor the diversity that's in it and support one another in perhaps separate focuses we may have.
Yeah.
Because I mean, it may come to pass that the work that we might be able to do here at St. Aidan's might be direct. For instance, I mean, recently on a controversial subject, we erected those doors for Pride Month.
Yeah.
That's a very different thing than what the mosque is going to do, and they had their own issues at what happened up at the campus with the poster, right?
Yeah.
So we have to understand when Imam Tawakal and I come together that we have different views on this, but our spirit, our heart for what we're trying to do is the same, which is to love people and to uphold people. And so I pray that we're going to get to the
And to
place where we,
prioritize the marginalized, right?
yes, absolutely.
All of
And
them have
so
that in common. Yeah.
that's right. And I think that we need to get to a place, like one of the things I found out in my research in Windsor when I was doing my doctoral work, which was in this area in interfaith work, there are far more Muslims in Windsor
Hmm.
than there are Anglicans.
Mhm.
And so, but if you would talk to most white bread Anglicans down there, they'd think, we're it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's the challenge. That's the hump that we got to get over, is to realize that our neighbors, our friends, our people on the PTA and at the soccer field and everywhere else,
Mhm.
they come in multi-faith and pluralistic ways to our communities now. And we have to find ways to mobilize the works of goodwill that are true to all of them
Yeah.
in a unified way to have the most impact.
Yeah. It seems to me that poverty is, we're losing it. We're losing our ability to really impact what's going on. And what people tend to do is that they then focus on politics. They want
Mm.
politics to fix this problem. The difficulty is that politics is so divided. It's,
Oof.
and I can speak for that from personal experience, but it really is there. On the other hand, if civil society, with faith groups and others, are able to combine and pivot and
Yeah,
combine their efforts, so that would be all of the agencies coming together to work with one another rather than all operate independently as they often do, for funders to do the same thing, right?
yeah,
For faith groups to come together and say the problem of poverty is now so great, or even climate change, that
yeah,
only our combined efforts are going to allow us to be able to address it, because we can't see a political solution at the moment coming out of this because it's so divided. But it would seem to me, if the different faiths came together and they helped to focus this community on the marginalized and what can be done, they could also resource it. They could help to fund. They could use their buildings. They could provide emotional and spiritual leadership. Right. I
yeah.
think that would be really important, and I would hope that we would see that. And I just get this sense, if it does happen, you're going to be in the middle of all of that.
Well, I hope I am, because I think it's critical work.
Yeah.
Because I do believe you're right. I mean, I think how much easier would it be for the government of Ontario or the government of Canada to look at London as an example and say, we've got funding that we want to use to fight poverty or combat climate change.
Yeah.
And instead of having to have like we do in a lot of the nonprofit sector. Instead of having competing interests,
Yeah.
here's a body faithful in London, and really mean that in the broadest sense of the word. People of faith and goodwill from across the region that are working cooperatively to address poverty in the city or to fight climate change in the city. Say,
Yeah.
for the government to be able to say, yeah, we'll partner with that,
Yeah.
because that's not supporting the Anglicans or the Jewish community or the Roman Catholics or whatever. This is supporting the effort of poverty reduction, and we're using the faith community, which has now pulled its resources together. And I don't just mean money here; I mean people. More importantly,
More important.
then I think it will be much easier for us, and we all want this. Like we all want this. Our faiths drive us to say we must do something about this.
Yeah.
And but it all begins with not seeing the other as other, right? It all begins with getting past that hump of whether it's bigotry or religious bigotry or fear or xenophobia or all that stuff. Once we overcome that, we can get somewhere.
Yeah. Kevin, for people like me, I tend to look at bigger picture stuff, but when I think of the pandemic and what we all went through as a community, the business community gave us this large amount of funds to help us to distribute greenhouses free of charge or greenwells free of charge. And I reached out to you trying to figure out a way to get that started. And you didn't take a greenhouse, you took three.
Yes.
Right, and that's what you did. So last week when we had the Curb Hunger Food Drive, which is run by the City of London, not by the Food Bank, they had it at St. Aidan's Church. So there was an understanding there. Right at the side of Sifton Bog, you had green walls growing up there on the thing. You had three greenhouses. We're out of time here, but I just wanted to thank you for taking our faith and not just trying to combine it with other faiths, but to reorient it again towards the original messages that were true in the Jewish scriptures, or in Quran, whatever, right? We focus on the marginalized, because that's what communities should do. And I just wanted to thank you for doing that, Kevin. I think you've been a bright light in this community in a very, very dark time. And I hope you realize just how much you and the good folks at St. Aidan's have done for us as a community, that we're looking at what you're doing as something that's very present in the moment and meeting people that are struggling.
Well, that's very kind of you. I mean, the people here are incredible at this community, I believe.
But I just want to thank you on behalf of the community. I know that the mayor was there at the press conference. He's very aware of what St. Aidan's is doing and what other faith groups are doing as well. But I think the importance to poverty and the alleviation of poverty and social justice, I just can't see it being successful without the faith communities coming together. And I think you've really taken us a long way along that. So thank you, Kevin.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you very much.